There was once a man named James who grew up to be a successful character, lost in his own little world. From the outside, everyone saw his accomplishments, from the smallest wins to the monumental achievements. They also saw his flaws and mistakes, every single one of them, perceiving and judging, scrutinizing each one, most of which were prudently ignored by its host. However, above all this, they all stood in awe of what this man created. All his works spoke of his dedication to his craft, the intenseness of which he devoted his time, commitment to his goals, obligations that were all followed through on. All his hard work led him to this point of his life, to be continually congratulated upon, but to also be despised and hated. There was a slight miscalculation on his part. James truly had it all. A perfect life. Through and through, he had perfected a formula, the recipe to live a successful life, through means of fulfilling his dreams. Amongst many other superior principles he lived by, he made several wise choices, always seeking the best possible outcome in any situation, determined to live an effective life by his own accord. James was only 34 by the time his work was nationally recognized. His work as a neuroscientist granted him the ability to see the world in ways most people could only dream of. However, he wasn't always in a state of victory. Like all of us, James is a normal person, living his very normal life. He was born in Sydney, Australia in 1995. The clock struck 3:08 a.m. in the morning when his eyes first peered at the blinding whiteness of the delivery room. His mother, while exhausted from labor, managed to breathe a sigh of relief, while her husband gently held his son for the first time with a welcoming embrace. In a time before James, there was Oliver and Clara. His parents were both white-collar workers. Clara, his mother, worked in HR for a company that dealt in international logistics for seafood. On the other hand, the father, Oliver, a loyal employee to a tech startup at the time, would function as an essential backbone to his company. Both of them met through a mutual friend's party in their early 20s. They had locked eyes intermittently, exchanging curious glances every now and then. She approached him out of novelty, and in his heart he was ecstatic. They had much in common, although, truth be told, Oliver would ask the mutual friend about Claire's interests when she wasn't around. He was surprisingly clever, and she was naturally empathetic. They flirted, but of course it was awkward at first, both individuals testing the waters, seeing how deep they could wade in, and before they realized it, they were neck deep. However, it wasn't perfect, like all things. Eventually, their friendship grew into a relationship. Hours spent getting to know one another. Days spent learning each other's surface-level interests. Weeks spent deepening their connection and bond. Months nurturing their budding ties and emotions. Years melting into each other's souls. Then, life happened, as they say. Life goes on, and so do experiences. A small argument here and there, snowballing into disputes about nothing, absolutely nothing because of small nothings. Periods of quietness, then altercations that arose from the silence. Their deep and thoughtful conversations that once blossomed from small talks, evolved into resentful arguments and spiteful exchanges. Despite all this, they managed to work their differences aside and learn from each other, pursuing something more than empty meaning within their relationship. Both of them were quite content with how their own personal lives were turning out. They continued on, through their failures and fights, and in this, something accidental happened. Clara became pregnant, even though Oliver was sure that he was impotent. Curious questions that sparkled in his mind. A thorough doctor's visit cleared up the fog. He wasn't entirely sterile. After all this, the waters were still muddied. The pair were struck with all types of feelings upon realizing this. An emotional roller coaster of sorts. Were they both ready? Was the child truly meant to be? It didn't matter, as the clock was now ticking in their faces. They had a change of heart. One as well as the other were filled with joy for the incoming life to be. Exciting as it may have appeared, they both harbored feelings of anxiety about it as well. Not sure if they would be great parents, unsure if they would be able to provide the proper amount of love and attention. Nonetheless, they were both eager to break the news to their friends and family. This unborn child was to be named after their close mutual friend James, the very same friend that introduced them to each other years ago. Clara was tired of working all the time, and she would claim that her back started aching. Oliver was in the same boat, constantly working long hours to try and make ends meet. It wasn't a perfect life, but they were determined to make it a good one, taking the necessary sacrifices where they could to ensure that the pregnancy was a success. Ultimately, they failed in their relationship, but they refused to allow the child to reside in an unhappy home. They made amends towards one another, which ultimately proved to be an intelligent gamble. While they both were busy parenting James in his early years, they failed to uphold their own lives. Their health slowly dwindled, both mind and body. Their work was also taking away from their well-being. A collective effort was made from both of them to prevail, to see that their kin was given full opportunity, all for the sake of James, to ensure he was raised with vigor and strength. Quite the shy person, James would spend time mostly by himself. In his developing years, he was an avid bookworm and buried his head within the confines of pages. His parents would eventually notice and would nurture this habit. He was a young boy when he read about the lobster and its supposed immortality, reading about its seemingly infinite supply of enzyme telomerase, an enzyme which suspends the lobster in a state of perpetual youth. This particular enzyme isn't entirely unique to the lobster. It's also found within humans as well, and as a young man entering his collegiate years, he grew increasingly interested in spending time by himself and learning more about his interests. James was obsessed with the idea that humans would obtain immortality as the next step in evolution. Thus, being so engrossed with this idea, he failed to give his formal education any attention. Being so enraptured with this singular idea forced his social circle to start out small as a child and to remain a minor role in his life. However, he took notice of this, observing his fellow schoolmates play during recess. How inept his social skills were, lacking in ways others flourished. It was this critical observation as a young boy that further led him down a path of isolation. It wasn't because he lacked interest in what others were up to. It was simply because he was already captivated by his own interests. Whilst his schoolmates enjoyed each other's company, he was absorbed by his own. Mainly, his books are what stole his time away. He was engrossed by the words, scanning each page for further information. The more words he absorbed, the more his social ability dwindled and diminished. As the years passed, he read more and more, an extreme appetite to digest all types of knowledge. He certainly was a ravenous individual, always seeking further, never content with the status quo, endlessly pushing the boundaries. What wasn't mentioned was that James struggled through all his years in academia, as he had neglected all other subjects that didn't capture his interests. His parents would scold and shame him in an attempt to somehow encourage him. Oliver and Clara were already stressed from being overworked. From James' perspective, he observed his parents. Long days and long nights transformed them from loving and kind people into hollow vessels of spite and difficulty. It was around his college days that James realized he should focus on his goal, solely on his goal, nothing more, and to sharpen his focus. The nucleus of his studies was immortality, of course, and in the blink of an eye, college passed, and he graduated. A full scholarship awarded him to pursue a PhD in neuroscience. He broke the news to his parents. They wanted to celebrate, but he declined, already being so interested in the one thing he dedicated his life to. All the moments that led him here. With a feverish pace, he quickly finished his thesis on his obsession. With a confident look on his face, he presented in front of the board. He had no other option but to apply himself. Impassioned during the presentation, and a potent message that was delivered, the board discussed in a short while after. They simultaneously congratulated James on earning his PhD. While several members offered him a career to work with them, he was filled with momentary joy. Seeing how his work had granted him this opportunity, his family wanted to celebrate, but he wanted to waste no more time. his efforts all allocated into his studies. Reluctantly, he brushed them off. A few days passed, and several phone calls later, he accepted a job offer from Mr. Carpaccio, founder and lead scientist at Higher Brains Incorporated, a company that specializes in gene editing. Mr. James, the gene editor, what a title. James was instantly gratified, but he wasn't finished. Months turned to years, and he worked his way up to lead a project of his own, to develop an enzyme that will essentially reverse the aging of cells. However, by the time he was 28, he realized Higher Brains was not working for his benefit any longer. There were minor disputes between him and Mr. Carpaccio about the workload and the general direction the company was headed. So he left, and with his dream in mind and experience intact, created Brain Cells LLC, his own company that strictly focused on achieving immortality. The logo was a callback to his childhood fixation, a simplistic rendition of a lobster within a human brain. He formed this company by the time he was 30. While it initially struggled to acquire funding, he found support where he least expected it. His parents introduced the idea to their mutual friend James, who was delighted at the opportunity. Thus, it was set that both of the James charted their course and set off. Unbeknownst to them, something precious was about to be born, a spectacle to bring the world to a new age. A few scrapped projects later and several coffee breaks in between. Both of the James collaborated brains one foggy morning, sharing breakfast together, a seafood brunch. While one crunched on a shrimp, the other was sipping a mimosa. As the waitstaff came by and inquired how the food was, a neighboring table was being delivered a large boiled crustacean on a plate. The sheer gargantuan size of it. The man broke the shell with a cracker tool, splintering it. The meat inside looked tender and juicy. They both observed this. Then, a sense of purpose enveloped both of them at this point. Words were slowly exchanged and became ideas. Both men were stirred, curious to see where this would take them. What direction to take the company in now, especially with all the failed projects at hand. The proverbial writer's block was lifted. As they parted ways that fateful morning, it was clear to both of them where they should lead the company. A few months passed, and many sleepless nights later, James was planning on cutting out his business partner from the company, mainly for ideological disagreements. Young James had offered the older James a golden severance package. Older James was tired of his partner, stating he was turning inward, acting selfishly, and transformed into a shell of who he once was. Young James believed otherwise, claiming he was doing what he was made to do, what he was born to do, what he was best at. They parted ways for good this time. James had just turned 34, and despite all shortcomings, he believed he had finally made it. A nice home on the seaside, overlooking the kingdom below. He truly had achieved his dreams, wanting exactly what he wanted, fulfilling his every desire, buying the material needs that he wished for. Working all this time granted him the ability to purchase whatever his heart yearned for. He could throw money at a problem, and it just goes away. It was as simple as that, far from the perfect image that he was relaying to the outside world. His inner world was filled with demons, every single one piercing a gaze outwards, extending their metaphorical reach to break through his skin, trying to escape, trying to show the world who he really was. Had he truly perfected the formula for a perfect life? Is this exactly what he wanted? He was just as confused now as he was when he was a child. Though, that didn't entirely matter to James at the moment. He had other pressing issues at hand. He was on a breakthrough. This was perhaps the next big moment in his life, and he wanted to share it with the world. Share it with the people who mattered most in his life. A new day rises, and a cup of coffee is being prepared. James was ready to present his idea to the world. He managed to edit the enzyme telomerase in such a way that humans could effectively regenerate an infinite supply, and utilize it in such a way that it could be employed at will, just as the lobster could. With this in mind, The modified version was capable of so much more, to the point of complete regeneration of old, sickly, and dying cells. He had essentially invented the fountain of youth. This was groundbreaking, perhaps the most advanced development for humans thus far. He had achieved what no other person had done. It was almost godlike. In fact, some hailed his labor as God's work. Others shunned him for his efforts. The world was in complete disarray and disagreement. He thought he had accomplished something monumental, something that everyone would have been proud of, something that everyone could have benefited from. When the news slowly started to gain international recognition, that's when he thought that maybe things would change. James couldn't have been more wrong. His quick launch into stardom was shrouded in infamy. Some were swift to declare that he had cheated death. Others were prompt to bury his work and career. He wasn't satisfied. He wanted to prove to everyone that his work meant something. For obvious reasons, he backed his findings and found support where he could. And slowly, the world started to see that what he created was completely immoral and unethical. His work sprung forth too many questions that he attempted answers to. What if someone didn't want to live forever? Then they could just opt out and have the gene removed. Would having the gene removed classify this person as any less of a human? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Would you classify an amputee as such? What are the long-term effects? His research only scaled to the next 3 generations. Beyond that, the solution was unclear. That's a good question to be answered for the future. There were just way too many tough questions. He was overwhelmed. It wasn't just coincidence, all of this. Convinced that the world was being ungrateful, rather than glorifying him and his work, he turned to the only people he could trust. However, his parents were reluctant to accept his calls and return texts. He showed up at their door on a rainy day. They greeted him unenthusiastically, but acted coy and opposed to his presence. Oliver shook his hand and Clara offered an empty hug. He accepted both of these, but they felt forced. Awkward even, and beyond that, almost out of obligation. His initial reaction was that they sided with the world, how the rest of the humans see him. He asked why they acted such a way. They couldn't give him reasonable answers, at least none that he was willing to accept. They explained throughout the years of supporting him, from his childhood to just shy of a few years ago. They truly loved and cared for him, but realized that this relationship was a one-way street. When he was a child growing up, James was quite introverted, almost to a baffling fault, as he didn't seem to care other people existed. He only saw his parents as people who satiated his physical needs, often demanding more, never truly pleased. Truthfully, he was a needy child. Approaching his teenage years, his temperament grew worse, secluding himself in his bedroom with his things and toys, his parents working the long hours to supply the seemingly endless hunger, attempting all problems with labored effort, trying to appease their son in any which way, shape, and form. Although they saw how his brilliance shone when he did share with them, outcompeting his colleagues, how a diamond sparkles amongst the pebbles. Then he was sent off to university, where the truth in his character shone even brighter, and that he was honestly, deep down, a shallow and selfish person. Every birthday, they would call him up, excited to hear their son and his voice, perhaps about his endeavors at work, or maybe developing his personal life more. Maybe he would confide in them secrets he had been keeping for a while, or that he was, in the most simplest way, just happy to hear from them. But through it all, they received a ringtone and his voicemail. He was too damn busy to even return a phone call, let alone send a text. As the years turned, so did their interest in their own offspring. And so, just like that, with their estranged son in front of them, they couldn't help but wonder who he was. Who was this man on their doorstep on a Sunday afternoon? They surely didn't know, because he also didn't know them. He never bothered getting to know his parents. He never cared for what other people were like. He was only truly passionate about his hobbies and work. So self-engrossed in one's own world, the air grew tense and heavy. He stormed away begrudgingly. At the tender age of 36, James was walking the planet. Not as he imagined, not as he dreamt, but something far and foreign from his original plan. The dawn approaches, the sunbeams light up his seaside home. He sat on his porch with a cup of tea. Ahead, his eyes were set on the brimming waves below, contemplating at all his life choices, wondering how it got so strange. Ultimately, he was at a loss for words. He thought that everything he had worked for was for this one project. Turns out, it was everything he had wished for. A comfortable life sitting above his peers, the pinnacle of the food chain, atop the metaphorical pyramid, so to speak. He was genuinely impressed with himself, yet he still felt empty, yearning for something. He looked up into the sky, grinning. Is this life? He pondered. Is this all what it has to offer? To donate such a blessing to this world, only to be treated with disdain and scornful remarks. He stood up, leaning against the fencing. With the tea in his hand, he took a final sip. He carefully perched himself on the railing, sitting cross-legged and arms to his sides, balancing ever so carefully over the precarious ridge. A gust of wind came by, rocking his body. He went along with it, hoping that perhaps it would just be strong enough to throw off his balance. He knocked his neck back, eyes slightly opened. As he peered into the distance, he caught a glimpse of fishermen, hard at work bright and early in the morning, hauling in a humongous payload. The sun scattered across the ocean. Common seabirds dotted the sky up above. Clouds slowly washed over. The cliff sides emitted a powerful view. His garden sprouted the most voluptuous fruits and vegetables, some still growing, others ripe for the picking. He watched as critters came to and fro to visit the plot below, how they all interacted peacefully amongst one another. Between the chirps, whistles, and hums, he listened, taking turns out of his bird feeder and then his fruit trees. His gaze turned back to the sea and locked onto the boat. With strained eyes, he focused and saw. The fishermen were processing lobsters. He began to think, sitting in awe of all of this beauty. He was amidst all of this and felt something. Possibly he was going about his life the wrong way. How could he know for sure? He didn't want to waste another minute. He was approaching his 40s, with truly nothing to show, as he disregarded his work. His mind wandered, but his senses grounded him again. Suddenly, he stood up on the parapet, arms out to his side, swinging, catching his balance. Composure was regained. His eyes focused on the distance. Truly an inimitable view. He did have it all. He observed everything before him. Then a gust of wind came.